Let's start off with the debt crisis because this is a big deal in Africa. What kind of approach should the continent employ with all the officials from Africa coming into these meetings in terms of dealing with the debt burden?
Well, Africa is high on the agenda of the IMF, World Bank, and G20 meetings this week here in Washington. And unfortunately, all of the experts are saying that the current debt crisis that most countries in Africa are facing is worse than the crisis of 25 years ago. Now, while the majority of countries are in debt crisis in Africa, we see that they have the bleakest economic growth numbers, the worst job rates. So the challenges for Africa are very significant and being held high at this meeting. The reality is the majority of African countries need debt relief, need debt restructuring in order to deal with the food crisis, the climate crisis, and the poverty crisis. Without relief and restructuring, we're looking at losing decades of development across the continent.
Well, Eric, you just nailed it, but the debt cancellation becomes the big question. Who qualifies from Africa to have debt cancelled by the IMF, the World Bank, and so they can move on and be able to kind of consolidate whatever little is left?
So unfortunately, what the G20, IMF, and World Bank are discussing this week is how debt relief and debt restructuring for Africa and other countries around the world simply is not working. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we created new debt relief and debt restructuring processes, for example, what Zambia just went through, but it's too little, it's too late. And so what they're discussing on the agenda this week at the meetings is how to move forward real debt restructuring, real relief that involves everyone, China and the private sector, who now hold the majority of debts for Africa.
Well, let's jump into job creation for Africa's youth. This is a big problem, and there's a lot of divided opinion here as to whether it's lack of jobs, whether AI is going to inject jobs or take them away from Africa's youth, or is it an issue of governance?
I think it's all of the above. I think Africa is facing many challenges, and not only does it have the worst growth rates, it has the worst job rates. And the African diaspora, in particular in the Caribbean, are also facing this with 50% or higher, 60% youth unemployment rate. Those numbers are staggering across Africa. So one of the pieces has to be dealing with governance. Part of it has to be debt relief. But another piece that's being talked about for the first time at a very high level at these meetings is the use of artificial intelligence. And that's something that we all need to be concerned about, that we have to enter in the conversation about, because artificial intelligence could make a world for Africa where there are less jobs, not more jobs.
And very quickly, Eric, on a global level, how should the IMF World Bank meetings address the climate crisis?
Well, the reality is these meetings are so important. The most significant decisions for the entire world and Africa on climate change over the next 5 to 10 years will be made at the IMF, the G20, and the World Bank. What we need is essentially hundreds of billions of dollars every year that the IMF, the G20, the World Bank needs to move forward and needs to invest in developing countries who don't have the ability to invest in climate mitigation and adaptation. So we're not moving quickly enough, but the reality is we have to raise hundreds of billions of dollars a year in order to deal with the climate crisis.